A lazy muscle leads to the most tender meat, but only one cut of steak is the tenderest. Both filet mignon and ribeye are absolute treats at the dinner table, so what exactly is the difference? Ribeye's very name gives you your first essential hint regarding this sought-after cut. Hailing from the rib section, the ribeye is known for having a rich, marbled texture and loads of beefy, buttery notes. It's no surprise it's a favorite among pros, who love it for its balance of tenderness and fat, and above all, for its rich flavor.
You like steak?
I do.
The ribeye is actually made up of 3 separate muscles, of which the central eye is the most coveted. You'll occasionally see this steak sold on its own, marketed as the eye of the ribeye. Filet mignon is a small steak taken from the narrowest end of the tenderloin, which runs along the back of the cow. This placement is what gives it its name, which comes from the French for delicate or dainty filet. Filet mignon is above all prized for its leanness and its tenderness. Indeed, not only is filet mignon lower in fat than many other premium cuts, but when perfectly cooked, it barely needs a knife. Filet mignon is similar to a tenderloin steak or Chateaubriand steak, both of which come from the fatter part of the same muscle. Some American butchers may mark filet mignon under other names, such as tenderloin filet or tournedos, which is usually cut into a round, very thick steak. Sometimes tournedos will be wrapped up in bacon fat or beef fat, which makes this lean cut all the more luscious when you cook it. Most of the essential differences between ribeye and filet mignon come from where they are cut from the cow, so it makes sense to begin the comparison there. Taken from the rib section of the cow, aptly named ribeye gets its amazing texture and flavor from the unique way in which this muscle is used. While not actively involved in the movement, the ribeye is essential for supporting the cow's consequential weight, an average of 1,400 pounds. Supporting the ruminant as it grazes means that this muscle develops loads of intramuscular marbling without the toughness of muscles that do more active work, like the shank, which keeps the cow moving. Filet mignon, meanwhile, hails from the loin section, an area that runs along the cow's spine roughly between the ribs and hips. The tenderest part of the loin comes from the aptly named tenderloin, boasting a plump middle section and a narrower tip. That tip is where we find the filet mignon. Seeing as the loin runs along the spine, it barely bears any of the animal's weight at all and has little role in its movement. The barely used muscle boasts a remarkably tender texture and very little fat. The heart or the eye of the ribeye is more scientifically known as the longissimus dorsi. This part is the tenderest and meatiest of the 3, making it the most sought after. Lovers of rich flavors love the cap, also known as the spinalis, since this part is the fattiest and most marbled.
So a lot of people call this the ribeye cap, and this is one of my favorite parts. You can see the spinalis right through here.
The complexus, meanwhile, is the small muscle towards the front of the steak. Depending on your butcher, you may find yours has a smaller eye and a larger complexus, or vice versa. Sometimes a steak won't have a complexus at all. As compared to the innate diversity in a ribeye, filet mignon presents a relative purity. Coming from the narrow section of the tenderloin and trimmed of any fat or silver skin, filet mignon is prized for being the same throughout, lean, soft, and almost melting in texture. The fact that the ribeye hails from the rib section of the cow should clue you into the fact that it may come with a bone attached, the rib bone. Bone-in ribeye may be sold instead as rib steak, and when the bone protrudes far enough that you can hold onto it, it's called a tomahawk, the perfect cut for fulfilling all of your wildest caveman dreams.
A caveman? A caveman?
Bone-in ribeyes are known for having loads of extra flavor thanks to the presence not just of the bone, but also of the marrow. They're also known for being slightly more difficult to cook, particularly for novice cooks. The bone keeps the meat immediately adjacent to it from heating up as quickly as the rest, meaning that a bone-in ribeye is likely to cook unevenly. That said, this could be to your advantage, especially if you're cooking for a crowd. A bone-in ribeye ranges from least done near the bone to most done at the edge of the steak. Of course, not all ribeye steaks have a bone, and boneless ribeye is both easier to cook evenly than bone-in ribeye and easier to carve, too. Seeing as it comes from a muscle that gets more work, ribeye is far more marbled than filet mignon, and that means a higher fat content. 100 grams of a trimmed raw filet mignon contains 7.1 grams of total fat, while 100 grams of a trimmed raw ribeye contains 10.6 grams of fat. If you leave the fat cap on your ribeye, it'll contain even more fat.
A lot more marbleization, a lot more fatty bits in there. I like to cook those medium because those fatty bits are going to be melty just enough for me to eat them.
Of course, one needn't be afraid of fat. Healthline reports that these days, research seems to indicate that the link between the saturated fat found in beef and high cholesterol may have been over-exaggerated. What fat means in this case is flavor. Ribeye is one of the most flavorful cuts of steak you can find out there. And what's more, the extra fat also makes it a bit more forgiving when cooking. More fat means more moisture, and a ribeye is more likely to stay juicy even when slightly overcooked than a tenderloin or filet mignon. If tender beef is what you seek, you'll surely find your bliss whether you opt for filet mignon or ribeye. Ribeye comes from a part of the cow that does a lot of work keeping the cow upright, but it's not used nearly as much as the shoulder, for example, which is best slow cooked if you want it to be tender. But while ribeye is indeed one of the tenderer cuts on the cow, it's got nothing on filet mignon, which hails from near the spine and thus does very little work.
It's just a big old lazy muscle, that's why it's tender. It doesn't do much, it's just hanging out back there. Doesn't really have a job, that's why it stays tender.
Filet mignon's chief attribute is indeed its tenderness, and sometimes to the detriment of flavor. Indeed, while the flavor of filet mignon is far milder than many others out there, it more than makes up for it with its tenderness. In some cases, you may not need much more than a fork to slice right through it. A good steak is rarely a bargain option, but when it comes to ribeye and filet mignon, you're looking at two fairly expensive cuts. Ribeye will usually retail for somewhere around $10 a pound. Premium steaks like Whole Foods grass-fed organic demand a whopping $25.98 per pound. Filet mignon, however, is in a whole other arena price-wise, costing somewhere between $20 per pound if you're buying straight from the farmer and $45 per pound if you're buying from a high-end butcher shop. The reason filet mignon is so expensive really comes down to the question of supply and demand. There is comparatively little filet mignon on each cow, with the tenderloin making up less than 1% of the animal, and the filet mignon coming exclusively from the smaller end of this long muscle. Filet mignon also requires butchers to do quite a bit of trimming before zeroing in on that perfect round steak. The resulting steak is a true luxury cut, perhaps best for special occasions.
I'm grilling us some filet mignon.
If you've got a good knife and a bit of patience, you can cut down on the price of filet mignon significantly by taking a trip to Costco. One of the best deals at the big box store is the whole vacuum-packed beef tenderloin. And while these loins are untrimmed, after you make your cuts at home, you'll find that you get not one, not two, but 3 different pieces to play with. It's certainly a bit more work than buying steaks from the butcher, but the payoff is totally worth it. As a leaner cut with less marbling than ribeye, filet mignon has a tendency to dry out if overcooked, or even cooked past medium. That said, seeing as it's so tender, it's almost impossible to undercook, and as such is the perfect cut to serve to fans of rare or blue beef. A hard sear on the outside and a barely cooked interior is sheer perfection on this cut. Experts recommend beginning with a room temperature steak and searing it in a vessel that conducts heat well, like cast iron, for about 3 minutes per side. Once a nice brown crust has formed, the filet mignon can be finished in an oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. About 6 to 8 minutes should result in a medium rare steak, though a bit less is recommended to take the fullest advantage of this delicate cut of beef. Seeing as ribeye has more marbling than filet mignon, it's a bit more forgiving of slight overcooking, which isn't to say that's what you should be shooting for. Experts recommend serving ribeye medium rare. The best way to achieve this sought-after temperature is to start it in a hot cast iron skillet, searing it well on both sides and allowing it ample time to rest. The resulting steak will have a lovely brown crust and a tender pink interior. Some like to cook their ribeye on the grill, which lends a welcome touch of smoky flavor to the steak. While you can certainly do this, a word of warning: ribeye's fat content means it can have a tendency to flare up over the grill. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, just be sure to watch it carefully as it cooks to avoid any accidents, encouraging smaller flares rather than big ones. The lower fat content of filet mignon means that it can use a bit of help in the flavor department. And what better to add than some fat? Butter is a classic steak topping for a reason, and it's no wonder you'll often see steakhouses topping their steaks with a pat of plain butter or compound butter. The latter suspends additional flavors in the fat, things like salt, herbs, spices, or garlic. And mild-mannered filet mignon is the ideal contender for this approach, seeing as it's a bit lacking in the flavor department. If you want to try this approach at home, making your own homemade compound butter couldn't be easier. Simply work the seasonings of your choice into softened butter, roll into a log, and wrap in plastic wrap. Chill or freeze until ready to slice off coins and use as you see fit. If you ask the pros, ribeye may well be king, at least as far as Katie Flannery is concerned. One half of the father-daughter team behind Flannery Beef, Katie terms the top 3 steaks as the ribeye, the New York strip, and filet mignon, and says that the ribeye is her favorite. Noting that the ribeye has more fat and hence more flavor, she goes on to say that preparing a ribeye is all about balancing the flavor of the meat and the texture of the fat. She also points out that the ribeye actually leads to less work when cooking. Thanks to its tenderness and flavor, adding just some simple seasoning lets both the natural flavor and tenderness of the ribeye shine. Her preferred method for cooking ribeye is grilling, noting that she tends to cook a ribeye a bit more than she would other steaks, partly doing this for the texture, but also to make sure that she fully cooks the fat.